Hello and welcome to this Q&A with the Fertility Alliance. And today we're joined by Alythia, who's going to be telling us a bit about her journey to parenthood as a single person. So, Alythia, I wanted to start by asking you, when did you first start thinking that you might want to go ahead and try to have a child without a partner?
I think realistically, I probably started seriously thinking about it about 10 years ago. Yeah, so probably 2015, I kind of went, okay, I need to try and come up with a plan. How do I? I've tried all the relationships that I'm willing to try at this point. I'm like, I now need to, yeah, just figure out how to knuckle down and get on with it. Yeah, so it was probably about 10, which feels like a lifetime ago now. But yeah, 10 years ago.
And how difficult was it to make that decision at that point?
I think by that point it was pretty easy. I had relationship fatigue. It was just I just thought kind of yeah, that was a nice relationship, but it wasn't they weren't somebody I'd have a child with, or they weren't somebody who, if I had a child with, we'd be able to parent together, whether we were together or apart. Because I was aware that relationships didn't have to stay, but I'd need to be able to parent with that person. And I never met that person, so I was like, okay, right, definitely going it alone is the way to do it. And as well, by then I was in my mid 30s, so age was it was like I haven't got time to keep looking for somebody to parent with. And ultimately, deep down, I realised that I'm happier single. So I thought I'd probably be happier parenting singly too.
And were there things that you were worried about before you set out on the journey?
Yeah, I think I definitely worried about finances, because I haven't got a high income career. So it was like, okay, how can I navigate it? I'm very blessed in that I work in childcare, so having my child with me was going to be something that's possible. So it kind of negated the expensive childcare element that a lot of parenting involves. But it was sort of like, but how do I make it work financially? What if I can't find a job straight away? What if I'm out of work? How do I, yeah, make sure that there's money coming in so I can keep a roof over our heads and food in our tummies?
And how did you go about starting to choose where to have treatment and where to go through the process? What was that like?
I just looked at fertility clinics in the local area. Also went to my GP, and spoke to my GP about my plan. At the time, it wasn't the GP weren't that the NHS weren't funding fertility treatment for solo people. So it was like, okay, I'll have a look at the local private clinics. So I booked a couple of open evenings to go and see what they said, see how the clinic felt, and to make the decision from there. So yeah, I went to two, and then I went to the fertility show, which was really useful. And then the pandemic happened. Everything on hold for a little while, but ultimately then I then sort of did an online. I was then able to do the online open evenings to kind of. So I actually just went back to the same two clinics I'd been to in person, just to kind of go, okay, how does it feel now? What's the online presence? What do I get? And I got the same sense from the clinic that I decided I was going to choose.
And what was it that you liked about it?
It just had a really lovely, it seems like a weird thing to say, but a really lovely homely feel. The staff were very friendly and warm and welcoming. It didn't feel like a clinical environment, because as much as I was doing, I was planning to conceive a child in a not so natural way. I wanted it to feel like as natural a process as possible. So feeling like I was, just going somewhere that's really nice rather than going to a clinical medical environment for a procedure. So yeah, it made it, yeah, and it felt like they took me as a person and my medical history and everything on board, rather than just a case that your age, these are the stats, this is what we do. It was a case of like, what's your history, what's your menstrual cycle like, which was, yeah, really beneficial.
And what about choosing a donor? How did you start that process?
So that was a bit harder. So at first I kind of thought, okay, so the cheapest option, I kind of went like financially, what would be the cheapest option? The cheapest option would be to choose a UK donor, because I wouldn't have the import charges and shipping fees. But there was limited information, and as much as I didn't want to know the person who I was going to be choosing, I wanted to know a bit about them so I could, for that nature nurture argument, choose that little bit of nature that my child would inherit. Um, so yeah, and then I then went, okay, next thing would be I looked at American banks, because I knew there was a larger selection, and because I wanted a donor with a similar heritage to mine. went to the American banks, and I was overwhelmed with the information. For me, for some people, I've met so many people, and some people love the amount of information you get. But for me, it was like, well, that's I don't want to know what they look like as an adult. I don't know. That's I don't want that image in my head. And then so then looked at European sperm banks, and yeah, and I found that that was the right balance for me with the information that was available.
And what did you use? What information did you use to make your choice? What swayed you?
So I initially just filtered it down by the physical characteristics. So, sort of like, height, eye color, the ideals, skin tone and everything. And then, I mean, I didn't have a huge choice, but then it was just reading through the profiles and seeing which one kind of spoke to me the most. And yeah, the one that I chose, I was like, oh my goodness, that's the donor that I would like to use. And I did have a bit of an ordeal getting the sperm because I chose him. He was out of stock at that time. So I checked a note to be notified when he was in stock, and then when I got that notification a few months later, I thought, okay, when I get home, I'll order the sperm. And I got home, and he'd sold out again. So a very tearful evening. A few messages into a couple of solo mum groups I'm in. People saying you need to email the clinic. Email the clinic. They might be able to reserve stock for you because they quarantine the sperm. So I emailed the clinic, and I was very grateful to be able to reserve and get the final pregnancy slot. So it was like, oh my goodness. And that felt like, it was the last one available. I'm so glad that, I managed to, get a bit of advice from some people who knew, knew how it goes, who've been there before.
And did you tell your family and friends what you were doing at that point?
I did, yes, yeah. I told them right from the beginning. This is. What do you think? Yeah, I think I spoke to my parents first, and it was like, I think I'm going to have a baby on my own. It was like, yeah, okay, they're very not sure. Okay, yeah. My dad was kind of like, yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all. Because I've always been I've done lots of things on my holidays and things. So I think he was like, okay, yeah, cool, right. How are you going to go about it? What are you going to do? And I think they were just excited to have another grandchild.
And friends, were they supportive too?
Friends were really supportive. Yeah, I think most of my friends know that, for very most of my life, I've wanted to be a mother. So I think they were really supportive and really happy for me, and that I'd found a way that I could make motherhood happen.
Can you tell us a bit about the process you actually went through? What happened?
Yeah, so I actually did. So I went with a private clinic, and I chose. I bought 3 vials of sperm, and I decided that I was going to do. So from the beginning, it was like, right, I'm going to do 2 IUIs, and if they both fail, then I'll switch to IVF. And that was always like in my head, that's what was going to happen. And I did the 2 IUIs, and they both failed. And then I was like, oh my goodness, this is awful. I was absolutely devastated because it felt the most natural way to conceive without natural conception. And I just, so I felt devastated that that wasn't going to be my path. And I think at the time I didn't know very much about IVF, and I felt like it was going to be super invasive. I was going to be super ill, and I was going to be pumped full of hormones and things. And it is that for some people, but for me, thankfully, it wasn't. And I contemplated buying another vial of sperm just to give one more IUI a shot, but still having that one in the bank for the IVF if I needed it. And he was out of stock again, and I went, okay, that's the universe telling me to just get on with IVF. It was like by then I was 40, approaching 41, and the universe was like, no, come on, you've just got to get on with it. If you want this to happen, let's make it happen. Um, and when I spoke to the clinic that I was with, and one of the nurses said to me, "Have you been back to your GP?" And I said, "Well, no, they don't support solo women. It's no point." And she said, "Oh, my local CCG's recently changed their stance. It's worth going back to your GP." She said, "We'll absolutely do it, but it's worth going back to your GP." So I went back to my GP, and a month prior, my local CCG had changed their stance. So I went, I might be able to get around an IVF on the NHS. So because of so I went back to the GP, who took the GP was amazingly supportive, took a huge, very thorough, asked all the questions. She said, I don't think I need to know this, but just in case they ask, let's just speed it through for you, which was really lovely. And yeah, and I was really lucky that based on my history, because I've had 3 losses in the past when I haven't been trying to get pregnant. So having had previous losses, and having 2 failed IUIs, I was eligible for 1 round of funded IVF. which was really lucky. So then that took I was sad to be leaving the clinic that I'd chosen behind because they were so lovely. But my NHS clinic were absolutely amazing, and it felt really nice there. And yeah, again, the consultant really listened to me, so that the hormones I was put on were minimal, and actually I sailed through the IVF, which was really lovely. Had a really successful first and only necessary round. So yes.
And were there things you discovered along the way that you wished you'd actually known at the start? I mean, presumably the NHS funding situation might have been one of them.
That would have been, yes, but that, I mean, at the time that wasn't, yeah, I mean, it changed. I think the timing was just, yeah, there. I was very lucky, that timing changed just as I needed to do the IVF. Um, I think at the time, I think when I was planning it and financing it all in my head and on paper, I hadn't thought about the fact that my GP might be able to do some of the blood tests that were required, to save on some of the expense because the blood tests through the clinics can be quite pricey, but also that they're at home. There are clinics where you can draw blood at home to have your levels tested, which can make it cheaper than a clinic if your GP isn't as supportive as mine was. So it can be luck of the draw sometimes. Um, but I think everything else. I think by the time I got to that point, I'd been in the solo mum online community quite avidly. So I'd been reading about other people's stories and other people's journeys. So I had a vague idea of what to expect. In fact, I think my idea of what to expect was probably worse than my reality, just because we tend to share the negative more than the positive. So
That's a really interesting comment, actually, because I think sometimes that is quite true, isn't it? That you hear a lot of the bad stuff and not so much of the
not so
positive
much of it.
thing.
Yes, yeah. It's only if someone asks the question that then, yeah, the positive stories come out, I think.
Mm. And what would be your key tips for other people going through this?
Go for it. It's amazing. I would say, yeah, reach out for support. So there are various networks available, lots of charities that can support you with the right information, and there are lots of online communities where you can go and you can ask your questions, and there'll be at least one person, if not lots of people who've got a similar profile to you, like similar age or a similar career issue or a similar home issue, and that can talk through, or people that are where you want to be, who can give you their take, their ideas. So it gives you fuel for thought, but also answers questions that anyone might have.
And what about around that idea of making the decision in the first place? Do you think there's anything that might help people with
And
that?
I think whatever challenges there are, you kind of you face them and you overcome them. Because especially what it's just, yeah, especially once you get that success rate and that persistence and that dream, and it's just about achieving a dream. And yeah, and it's one that's well worth pushing for and fighting for if it's what you want. But yeah, you won't regret it.
I just
It'll be hard at times, but you won't regret it.
I just had one other question actually, which was around the kind of how it was when those IUIs didn't work. Did you feel surprised that they didn't work? I mean, did you almost sort of expect it to work?
Yeah, I did. I absolutely did. So the first one, I was like, okay, well, we just had to figure out what my body was doing, whether the trigger shot timing was right. And the first one it was disappointing, but it wasn't heart wrenching. The second one was heart wrenching because I was so convinced that the second time we'd get it right. And I think because in my head I'd done two IUIs and then IVF, it was like, oh, that's the last chance to do it as close to naturally as possible. Um, so I kind of went, oh, so it was a big hurdle because then it was well, it was kind of like that's more of my finances going to become, I wouldn't, even if I had to pay for it, I wouldn't have regretted it. But it was just in that time, it was like, oh, I had banked that money for a longer maternity leave and bigger savings account sort of thing. So, but yeah, I think that, yeah, the second IUI definitely hit really hard. It hit really hard. I remember, yes, there was a lot of emotion around that one. But the fertility counselling I did was, I spoke to my counsellor about it, and she was really useful at helping talk me through it, and yeah, sort of rationalised that it wasn't the end of the road. I still had options. I still had sperm, and that, yeah, I could carry on with the process.
Alethea, thank you so much for joining us. That was absolutely brilliant, really interesting. And thank you for your time and thank you for speaking to us. That was really great. Thank you.